Let me introduce Sir Masood Ahmed. Masood Ahmed has just recently been knighted by the British government. That's why we are calling him Sir Masood Ahmed. Not like Pakistan, we call everybody Sir. So please, he's just been knighted by the British government, which is a rare honor. Masood is one of our most accomplished Pakistanis. He has worked in the World Bank and rose to the position of Vice President. He was a very important man in the World Bank. Then he did something very wise. He decided to cross over into the fund. So he rose to being the director of the Middle East in the fund and the director of the External Affairs Department in the fund, which is, you can think of it as a secretary in the fund administration. So he was a secretary in two departments, and he ran the Middle Eastern department, which is about Pakistan. Pakistan is in the Middle Eastern department. So if you want to ask anybody questions on the program, he's the right man. He did the program in Nawaz Sharif's time, so he is the right man that should ask about those things and about the fund programs. Now, I'm very honored that Masood gave us the time to be here. He's stopping only for a day in Islamabad to talk to us. So please use his time wisely. So let me begin by asking Masood to give you a rare insight into something that आप लोगों को नहीं पता चलता अक्सर. हम इसको bilingual रखेंगे इसलिए because we've got some foreigners. तो बट ये है कि मसूद साहब से मैं ये पूछना चाहूँगा पहला सवाल कि जी इंटरनेशनल डेवलपमेंट बहुत सारी चीज़ें हो रही हैं. अभी आ रहे हैं मराकेश से जहाँ IMF की वर्ल्ड बैंक की मीटिंग हो रही थी. He's been to many international fora, he speaks on them, he talks about them. So he's going to tell you some very interesting things about what is happening in the international economy in terms of development thought and in terms of what to expect in the future. Masood sir.
Thank you, Roksab. First of all, I have to say, this is fantastic. I mean, congratulations to you and to all your team. Just to be able to get all of these students, and most of the people in the room are students together, I mean, it's a great feat. So, really. Secondly, my plea to you is, let's make this a conversation. Please, आप सवाल उठाएं. मेरे पास जवाब होंगे तो मैं जवाब दूंगा. नहीं तो कम से कम वो सवाल ही मैं ले जाऊंगा अपने साथ to think about. So, please, let's make this as interactive as possible. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail of the world economy, but here are three things about the world economy which I took away from the time I was in Marrakesh, because they had the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. वो हर 3 साल बाद जो है annual meeting is not in Washington, किसी और जगह होती है. इस दफ़ा मराकश में हुई. The first thing is that if you look out for the next few years, the world economy is slowing down. हर जगह. Productivity is falling, and so what does that mean for a country like Pakistan? You can't rely on a very buoyant world economy जो हमें खींच लेगी साथ साथ. So first thing we should remember, world economy is slowing down. Not just this year, next year, but अगले 5 साल. Second thing, interest rates आपने देखा यहाँ बढ़ गए, सारी दुनिया में बढ़ गए. Interest rates are now all-time high in the US. And most people think कि ये अगले 2, 3, 4 साल तक interest rates will remain higher for longer. So, you know, we've got very used to cheap money. For the last many, many years, interest rates were running at close to zero. Now, why does that matter to us? It matters to us because when interest rates are high, all the debt that we like, and you know, Pakistan is a country that likes to borrow, then the cost of borrowing becomes higher. And the second thing that happens is that the investments we need to make become less profitable. If you borrow money for part of your investment, then it becomes less profitable. And also, when you go to the market to borrow internationally, you don't find so many people who are interested in chasing you. Because when money is cheap, country like Pakistan goes and says, मैं जी आपको 5% interest दूंगा dollar पर. So a lot of investors who are sitting on assets, they're getting 1% or less than 1%. वो कहते हैं ठीक है यार, थोड़ी सी risk लेके let's put it in Pakistan. Today, in the US, I can invest in a T-bill, US government T-bill, and get 5%. So if a country like Pakistan comes and says, we'll give you 7%, people say, well, I've got 5%, yaar, kafi hai. So it becomes harder to get the money also. So interest rates are a big issue for a country like Pakistan. Third thing I want to say is that everyone feels that looking ahead, the economy in which we live, the world in which we live, is going to be a world in which there are going to be shocks, more often, more frequent, deeper shocks. Let's look back. Nobody knew COVID was coming. Nobody knew that Russia would invade Ukraine. Price of food would go up. Price of energy would go up. We were in Marrakesh and nobody knew that the Israel-Gaza war would start. So there are shocks that are coming, and I think we don't know what the next shock will be. But I'm confident that in our lifetime, certainly in your lifetime, there will be another pandemic like COVID. So there will be shocks that will come. So what does that mean for a country? It means that we have to become more resilient to shocks. And the international system also has to become more resilient to shocks. So I would say these are the three big takeaways that I took about the world economy and where it's going. We can discuss what that means for development, how we think about development, how we think about institutions. But those three things are worth remembering.
I think they're very well worth knowing. बिल्कुल आप ठीक कह रहे हैं. But ये बताइए कि अगर ये एक तो ये माना ग्लोबल एनवायरनमेंट बहुत डिफिकल्ट हो रही है कंट्रीज लाइक पाकिस्तान, इट इज डिफिकल्ट टू बोरो, और आपको पता है हम कितनी बोरोइंग का सोच रहे हैं. हमारे पास इस वक्त खसारे पड़े हैं तकरीबन 80 बिलियन पर ईयर फॉर द नेक्स्ट 3 इयर्स हमें चाहिए दुनिया से. तो अगर ये हम कहाँ से लेके आएंगे, और लेना बहुत मुश्किल होगा. नंबर 2, हमारे पास ये इंटरेस्ट रेट की जो बात कर रहे हैं, इट विल बिकम मोर एंड मोर एक्सपेंसिव, तो हम क्या करेंगे. तो ये बताइए जो ग्लोबल थिंकिंग में पॉलिसी मैनेजमेंट पे, डेवलपमेंट पे, उसमें क्या नई चीज़ें आ रही हैं.
देखिए, I can share with you how I see how our thinking about the process of development has changed. I look back, I worked in development like many people in this room for many years, many decades. I think there are 3 or 4 things that I take away from this experience, which have a bearing on the question that Nadeem asked. पहली बात तो ये है कि, when you look back 30, 40 years, our thinking about development was quite limited in terms of what we were trying to achieve and what we thought would bring about improvement in living standards. If you go back to the 1960s, वहाँ तो हमारी thinking ये थी कि बस labor or capital. These countries don't have capital. If you give them capital, you'll see improvement. Now we understand that development is a much more complex process. What determines how you use capital, people start talking about policies से फिर institutions से फिर governance से फिर elite capture, societal transformation. So it's a very big and complex thing. And what I've seen across countries, one of the advantages of working in a place as a World Bank, IMF, you get exposed to many countries. And the one thing I've seen is that the countries that have really transformed themselves, they had their own strategy. And it was a sustained hard work over many, many decades and predictable policies over the period, ताकि investors जो हैं उनको पता हो कि हम इस framework में invest कर रहे हैं. You can have good or bad policies, ज़ाहिर है, that makes a difference, but more important also is to have predictability of policies. उनको पता है कि जी, this is the frame in which we are going to invest, we are going to make returns. And it's mostly a country-driven process. You know, development agencies like to use country ownership. It's a bit of lip service, but fundamentally, without the countries driving it, the second thing I've learned over this time is the role of international institutions, but not just the World Bank, because we talk about the World Bank a lot, but जितनी भी international institutions हैं, उनका role is actually quite limited. They can't really shape the process of national development. It has to come from within the country. And then I would say the third thing I've learned is macro. IMF का काम तो macro है ना, basically looking at macro imbalances. Macro जो है, this is something you want to deal with in a way that it doesn't cause you to spend too much time on it. You had a chart a little while ago, I think Renab put up a chart which showed how often Pakistan goes to the IMF. So we can discuss why it goes to the IMF so often, but उसका नतीजा ये होता है कि public policy का focus becomes on managing the books, short-term account handling, how to avoid another boom bust cycle. So जो fundamental reforms पे discussion होना है in any country, which is what this is all about, that gets sidelined. And frankly, the thing about macro is that you want to avoid getting it wrong, but getting it right is only the basics. तो अगर आपकी सारी एनर्जी और सारा टाइम पॉलिसी मेकर्स का वो मैक्रो मैनेजमेंट में लग जाएगा, then you're never going to focus on the things that really get you from one point to the other. So, and the final thing I'll say, at least I've taken away in the lesson on development is, there are really no shortcuts. In so many countries, you see, they come up with some grand scheme, big project that's going to solve the problem. Actually, I don't think that there's much experience of shortcuts doing anything. Or one shortcut that people talk about a lot is, let's do debt restructuring. If you go and get our debt restructured, this will solve a lot of our problems. But you see, I mean, we can talk about debt restructuring if you're interested, but debt restructuring is also very often more complex and difficult thing, which in itself doesn't solve anything unless it's part of a broader reform strategy. So I think all of these things are lessons to take away about development.
I'm glad you raised the issue of debt restructuring. You know, we are close to default, and for the last year or year and a half, TVs have been yelling every night, default होने जा रहा है, default होने जा रहा है, ये हो जाएगा, वो हो जाएगा. उसकी solution में हमारे जो economists हैं, कुछ अफसोस आता है कि वो बार बार आके कहते हैं डेट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग कर दो. तो ये डेट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग के हमारे मांगने से एक दिन में हो जाएगी, बड़ा आसान काम है क्या? इसके क्या कॉन्सिक्वेंस है, समझा दीजिए हमें कि क्या होती है डेट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग.
देखिए, फर्ज करें आप एक कंपनी है और आपने देखा कि आपकी किसी वजह से भी आपका कर्जा बहुत बढ़ गया, आपकी बैलेंस शीट पे प्रॉब्लम है, आपके पेमेंट्स नहीं कर सकते आप बैंक को. देन यू से कि जी लेट्स गो एंड टॉक टू आवर बैंक कि भाई हम आपके जो रिपेमेंट्स हैं वो पूरे नहीं कर सकते. पहली बात तो ये है कि आई थिंक व्हेन यू गो टू योर बैंक फॉर डेट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग, आप उनसे कह जी ये हमने जो अगले पेमेंट्स से ये हम इसको आप ज़रा ये रीप्रोफाइल कर दें, थोड़ा इसको डिले कर दें, या ये कि बेसिक कम ही कर दें, इवन बेटर. सो फर्स्ट थिंग दे आस्क यू इज कि भाई ये तो आपकी बात ठीक है, विल टॉक अबाउट इट, बट व्हाट्स योर बिजनेस प्लान? आपकी कंपनी के जो ये प्रॉब्लम्स हैं, how are you going to fix these problems? What's your strategy? You have high costs, you have low returns, you have no sales. What is within which you're going to do this debt restructuring? And if you just say to them, नहीं वो तो हम करेंगे, एक वक्त आएगा, we'll do all that. In the meantime, can you just please forgive the debt? I think your banker is going to be a little bit less supportive of you. So I would say, sometimes countries are forced to restructure debt. Nobody goes into debt restructuring because they want to. They get forced into it because they have no alternative. But when you go into it, you have to recognize two things. One is that you need to have a broader business plan for the country, which is compelling and which explains to people that this strategy mein ye hissa debt restructuring ka hai. But look at all these other things we are doing. Pehli baat. Dusri baat ye, you have to be prepared that it is a painful and, I mean, I don't want to use words that are excessive, but it can be humiliating as a process. You know, there used to be the Paris Club. There still is the Paris Club. Paris Club mein sabse zyada jo hai, official debt restructuring ka jo framework hai, the Paris Club. And if you're the country that goes to the Paris Club to get your debt restructured, wo jo creditors hote hain, they make it very clear to you during the 2 days or a week that you're there, that you are there asking for something and they're there giving it. And I think that's something that is inherent in the way debt restructuring is done. And today, for example, debt is a big problem for a number of countries. Aadhi ke kareeb 40% low-income countries jo hain, they have big debt problems. But most of them are not going into debt restructuring because they know that once you go down that tunnel, it's dark, it's long, it's unpredictable, you don't know when you're going to come out and you don't know with what you're going to come out. So वो कहते हैं इससे बेहतर ये है कि try to avoid this as much as you can. So my sense is, look, it may well be that sometimes it's the only option. When it's the only option, you do what you have to do. We क्या कर सकते हैं? But don't think of it as a shortcut solution. कि हम ये कर लें तो फिर बाकी मुश्किल काम हमने नहीं करने पड़ेंगे, because that is not going to get you anywhere.
ये भी बताइए, at this moment कितनी countries debt restructuring मांग रही हैं या मांगने की कैफियत रख रही हैं या उनकी सोच है, और वो किस मुसीबतों से गुजर रही है? उसके साथ साथ एक और चीज़ है कि डेट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग में कुछ लोग तो आ सकते हैं. फॉर एग्जांपल वर्ल्ड बैंक तो रिस्ट्रक्चर नहीं करता, IMF रिस्ट्रक्चर नहीं करता, कमर्शियल क्रेडिटर्स भी तो हैं, कमर्शियल क्रेडिटर्स करें. एंड देन द प्रॉब्लम ऑफ चाइना, इन पे भी थोड़ी बात कर दें.
So debt restructuring is a topic that gets people very excited. उसमें लोग they specialize, they write papers about intricacies of debt restructuring. मगर मोटी बात ये है कि at the moment अगर low income countries को आप लें, so I would say about 30 of them have debt issues. उनका जो debt repayments हैं, they're very high, they're having difficulty, but they're managing. 3-4 ने ये कोशिश की है to ask for debt restructuring. Zambia is one of them. Chad was another one of them. अब ये Sri Lanka, next door to us, is another one of them. It's taken them over a year, sometimes 2 years, to negotiate the process. उस दौरान मार्केट से तो ज़ाहिर है कोई पैसे नहीं मिलते. Bilateral creditors भी हाथ रोक लेते हैं उस दौरान, because they're supposed to be thinking कि करना क्या. IMF can't do a program during that period, because as soon as you get into that issue, IMF has to wait for what they call financing assurances. Financing assurances का क्या मतलब? कि भाई before they go to the board, they have to say कि this is the debt agreement that this country has reached with its debtors. तो IMF वाले भी इंतजार कर रहे हैं. I was on a call the other day with somebody from Sri Lanka, and she was saying that it's been hell for us for the past year because nobody has been giving any support while we are trying to get the Americans and the Chinese to agree that who's going to share how much of the debt burden. Because creditors ki the concern ye hai na कि nobody wants to give more relief than the other creditor. अब इसमें एक problem हो गया. वो ये कि पहले तो पेरिस क्लब में it was a group of people, mostly OECD countries, US, Europe, Japan. They knew how to work. They've been doing this for many, many years. They have good processes. They understand the thing. Now, in most countries, the biggest creditor is not any of these countries. The biggest creditor is, as you will know, China. China has not been historically part of this club. So when you say to them, we're going to restructure debt in Sri Lanka, and here's how the Paris Club works, The Chinese say, okay, that may be how the Paris Club works, but we work in a different way. And they have lots of agencies in China. They are different. Exim Bank, the China Development Bank. हर एक का अपना हिसाब होता. So they are taking time to reach agreement. And because of that, everybody else is waiting as well. So the current status of debt restructuring is, you read any article, people will say it doesn't really work well. But they also say कि भाई इसके अलावा और कुछ है भी नहीं हमारे पास. So my sense is it doesn't work well now. एक साल बाद it still won't work well. So we should just think it's a very difficult path to go down. Don't go there. My advice for anyone is, इस रास्ते पे जाने से पहले आप बाकी सारे रास्ते और एक्सप्लोर कर लें, क्योंकि इस रास्ते में काफ़ी मरहले हैं.
Very good. So, debt restructuring should be the last option, not the first option. जैसे टेलीविज़न पे कहा जाता है कि डॉक्टर साहब बस डेट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग कर ले कल, जैसे कि सुबह जाके मांगेंगे और शाम को हम बहुत सारा पैसा लेके आ जाएंगे. आई थिंक वी शुड रिवाइज दैट ऑप्शन. बट एक और, लेट्स टर्न टू अनदर डायरेक्शन. एक और बात बताइए कि आपने IMF पे बड़े साल देखा है पाकिस्तान को, और बारीकी से देखा है सिंस यू वर द डायरेक्टर. तो आपने पाकिस्तान को काफ़ी प्रोग्राम, 2-3 प्रोग्राम तो मेरे ख्याल आपने देखी है. ये ज़रा लोगों को बता दीजिए कि व्हाट इज़ योर असेसमेंट ऑफ पाकिस्तान रिलेशनशिप विद द IMF एंड किस तरह वो, कैसे हमने इम्प्लीमेंट किया, प्रोग्राम की नौइयत क्या थी और क्या, थोड़ा सा हमें सिनॉप्सिस दे दें.
ये मुश्किल सवाल पे आ रहा है. So, look, you had a chart there. I think it was, I'm trying to recall which of your two colleagues made that analogy. It was you who said it. Okay. IMF जो है, ये अपना माइक बंद कर लो. IMF जो है is very much like the emergency room of the international financial system. And the IMF programs in Pakistan, of which there have been 24, they are quite successful in achieving one thing, which is that 1 year after they start, you find that the macroeconomic imbalances, the balance of payments problem particularly, gets largely contained. How does this happen? Economy slows down, imports go down, reserves begin to build up. So the risk of a balance of payments problem gets receded. But when you go to the emergency room every few months, suppose you're running a hospital, somebody shows up at the emergency room, first time you fix them and you say, thank you very much, bye-bye. फिर वो आते हैं कोई 3 महीने बाद, सेम प्रॉब्लम. आपने कहा भाई ये तो मैं फिक्स कर देता हूँ, बट these are the things you have to do to fix your, ताकि ये दोबारा ना हो प्रॉब्लम. You have to start walking 10,000 steps every day. अब आपका फ़ोन आपको बता देगा कि आप 10,000 steps कर रहे हैं कि नहीं कर रहे हैं. Please stay off all the high cholesterol foods that you're eating. Try to reduce a bit of stress and stop smoking, please. So the guy says, yeah, absolutely, let's write it down, ye sari cheezein. Then for about 2-3 weeks, they persist. Uske baad things get easier, life is better, go back to the old things. So they're back 3 months later. Then you say, did you do any of these things? It was very difficult, but now I'm really committed to doing it. Agli dafa. फिर आप short term fix कर देते हैं, then you have the same problem. So my friend, the problem is all programs with Pakistan, by and large, do well in the first 18 months, which is the phase of immediate stabilization. Uske baad, the difficult things have to be done. Kawaji, what about the fact that your energy sector is bleeding? That's what's causing a problem. Your tax. Nadeem and I have had a long-standing discussion about whether taxes are too high in Pakistan or not, or too low. But anyway, your expenditure exceeds your income, so you keep borrowing, you have to fix this. You've got all these impediments which stop your exports from growing. Here are things we agreed you would do. And then you've got all of these state-owned enterprises that are basically losing money and need to fix those. So we have a long list of things. The state bank needs to be autonomous, etc. And then you say, okay, what about doing these? So then you start to do them, and then you feel there's lots of pressure from different lobbies. You know, you want to go and put some tax on agriculture, you get your friends coming from there and saying, "Ke bhai nahi, ye to aapko pata hai, hum pe already itne taxes." Then you want to go and do something with the traders say, "Ke ji, ye to hum pe already bahut zulm ho raha hai." Uske baad you want to raise energy prices, and it's very hard to do it because most people can't afford the energy bill as it is. So you start slowing down on these things because politically it's hard to do these things. Also, you discover that by then your reserves are not bad, you know, they've improved a bit. Then the IMF comes along with the next review. I think they're coming next week. IMF comes along for the next review and they say, "Well, aren't you running behind on all of these things that you promised?" And you say, "Well, no, but actually we have started this and that. We've got a study underway." So it happens, this dance goes for a little while, and then you say, I think the best thing is कि अब हम थोड़े दिन के अलहदा हो जाए, आराम से आप जाएं, हम भी जाते हैं, let the program lapse. Then it lapses for a while. In the meantime, of course, जो चीज़ों से problem हो रहा था, वो आपने वही दोबारा शुरू कर दी. 3 साल बाद, you show up again saying, "Sorry, actually we have another problem now." So I think the history of the IMF in Pakistan is that they've actually been very successful at preventing a crisis. Now let me say, but not very successful at changing the way the economy functions. Let me just say one other thing, because I know a lot of my friends say, you know, the problem with these IMF people is that, why don't you guys just stop? Let there be a crisis, because it's only after a crisis that people change. तो आप क्यों नहीं हमारा पीछा छोड़ देते? If you really believe that the people don't do these things, then why do you keep coming to our help every time? Because, you know, this prevents us from doing the deep reform. It's a serious question. So I just want you to think about the following 2 things in answering that question. पहली बात तो ये कि when there is a crisis, a real default, a real payments crisis, I've seen it in some countries. Who are the people who get hurt? Actually, most of the people in this room will manage. But it's people outside this room, जिनकी कोई safety net नहीं है. They're the ones who get hurt. I'll give you an example of a country like Lebanon. You know, Lebanon, long time people were saying they were living beyond their means. They had a crisis about 4 years ago. 90% of Lebanon is now below the poverty line. So ordinary people are the ones who get hurt. दूसरी बात ये कि it is true that many reform efforts, deep reform efforts, only start after a crisis. That's the evidence. If you look at the econometric evidence across countries, it's true. But it's also true that not every crisis leads to reform. जैसे Lebanon is another example. 4 साल हो गए. People thought that if there is a crisis, these people will finally get together and do something. But 4 years later, nothing. Somalia, there was a crisis. 20 years later, they were doing nothing. So I think it's a bit risky to assume that agar crisis ho jaye, then we'll get together and do the reform. Because it may happen, magar ye bhi mumkin hai कि it may not happen. And if it doesn't happen, the people who pay the price are actually going to be ordinary people. So I'm a little cautious about this argument कि भाई आप होने दें crisis, उसके बाद ही ठीक होगा.
बड़े सवाल निकल रहे हैं इसमें से, बड़ी interesting discussion हो रही है, but let's see very quickly. Let me take the first issue. You're saying that not all, but most of the issues that arise in a implementation of successful stabilization program, and B, trying to have a consistent, sustainable growth path. Bilkul sahi kaha. But you've seen many reform programs around the world. Take China, for example, India. How is it? You've seen our growth chart that we showed you. Okay? हम ऐसे zigzag करते जाते हैं like a roller coaster. China का path ऐसे है. क्या है हम में और उनमें फ़र्क जो कि हम नहीं कर सक रहे? ये ज़रा आइडेंटिफाई करें फ्रॉम योर ब्रॉड एक्सपीरियंस द ग्लोबल रिफॉर्म प्रोसेस. What is it that we should do and we can't do?
Look, I think it's very hard to pick out a few things and say, okay, yeah, this is the key to growth, you know. I come back to one point that I made earlier. Let me add a core. So, pehla point to ye hai कि you keep your macro stable, get it out of the way. Don't let the macro become an obsession, you know. पहले तो ये है ना, you just have to sort out your basics. दूसरा ये कि you have to focus on laying out a medium-term path which is credible, that investors believe in, that you believe in, that you have a broad consensus for. Yeah, Pakistan, there's a lot of discussion of having a national economic charter, a national economic agenda. We don't really have a national economic charter of any consequence, कि जिसमें आप कह सकें कि भाई जो भी government आएगी, of course every government has at the margins some differences, but basically this is the direction in which we are going to go. Then you leave it to the professionals to do that. And the third thing I think that's also quite important is that you have to have a level of investment. You know, let's take a very simple thing. There was one chart that was very interesting chart you put up earlier, which showed investment rates. I think we have the lowest investment rate on that chart. And actually, we have a very low investment rate compared to the rest of the world. So if you don't invest, how will you have growth? सीधी बात है ना कि you can't really grow without investing. There's no magic way that you're going to generate growth and development. And if you don't grow, you really don't have an improvement in the human condition. एक ये भी मुश्किल है आजकल कि a lot of people who work in and around development, they say कि, you know, growth पे इतना obsession क्या है? Growth really is not what we want. It's about inequality, it's about poverty, it's about social conditions, human development. Don't be so focused on growth. But the evidence, my friend, is that if you look at the improvement in all of these indicators, they're very hard to achieve without improving the level of economic activity. So one thing I worry about is that we are losing focus on the importance of growth. And actually, it's one of my beefs with the economic profession in development economics is that most of the work that is now done in development economics, most of the PhDs that are being done in development economics are being done on specific intervention, RCTs, you know, these random controlled trials that कि अगर हम इस तरह करें या इस तरह करें तो क्या फ़र्क पड़ता है. But on the big questions of what can you do to help sustain higher growth rates, because without high growth you can't get any of these good things, that's something on which we are less focused than I think we should be. So I would say that keeping an eye on the medium term and having predictability and consistency is very important.
You referred to the obligation of the IMF to kind of ensure that the poor are protected, to ensure that the poor are protected. This is a mission that the World Bank has too. Doesn't that kind of create a disintermediation that the local population or the local elite or the local governance system, whatever you may, are not responsible for the poor, but international agencies are? How would you react to that?
So I would say, look, there are two things here. एक तो ये कि for a long time, when the IMF, this is more IMF than World Bank, I would say. So I don't know whether anybody is here from the World Bank or the IMF, but if they are, they can speak for themselves. But when the IMF used to do programs, you know, by definition, let's be clear about this, by definition, when you start an IMF program which is trying to stabilize the economy, that's another fancy term for simply saying you're trying to cut back on aggregate demand because you have an imbalance. You're spending more money than you have, you're importing more than you have exporting, so you have to slow down the economy. And initially, the IMF used to say, we don't care how you do it. Here's the fiscal target, abhi 7% hai. Next year it should be 5, year after it should be 4, then it'll be 3, it'll be stable after that. But we don't really care how you do it. And then a lot of NGOs started saying, okay, it's not just a question of going from 7 to 5 to 3, but where do you cut your spending? How you cut your spending matters, because sometimes you can cut spending that affects poor people more. And so they looked at a lot of IMF programs and they said, look, in these IMF programs, the expenditures on health and education went down because the government cut those. And then the IMF said, okay, fair enough, that's a good point. We need to find a way of protecting the way you cut spending. You have to protect the health and expenditures and spending on the poor. So for example, in Pakistan, they insisted, if I recall right, that BISP spending needed to be protected because it was a way of providing cash transfers to the poor. So I think that's why they were focused. Now you have a much more difficult question, which is, don't countries care about their own poor people? Why should anybody else have to care about them when the countries are caring themselves? So I just leave that as a question for you. Do you feel confident that in all the spending decisions that are being made and all the taxation decisions that are being made, that people are thinking first and foremost of the poor? Be a good question for you to think about.
What we also see is that we have so many policy obligations. It's not just that the IMF is imposing conditionality. The World Bank is also imposing conditionality. Then we've counted, I think Fahim Jahangir has a thesis on this, that there are about 100 donor agencies sitting in Islamabad who are all imposing all kinds of conditionality on us. And we find that our government is almost incapable of handling those conditionalities. So they're kind of tossing the ball here and there, running around. How long is this development aid business going to continue, or should it continue? Is there a sort of end to it, or will it continue forever?
So there's a lot of literature.
This is addressed as your hat. Masood Ahmed also runs a Center for Global Development, so answer that with that hat on.
Okay, there's a lot of literature on conditionality. And what's the value? Turn your mic off, otherwise it just resonates. What's the value of, should there be conditionality of any kind? What kind of conditionality should there be? Is the way it's done sensible or not sensible? So we can spend hours discussing conditionality. But I think that the issues, what I've seen across many, many years, many, many countries is the conditionality that works is when there are people inside the country that want to achieve certain changes. And they use the international institutions as a way of reinforcing the momentum within the government, because, government is not a homogeneous body. You may want to achieve something, but there'll be somebody else who they'll be opposed to it. And the government, they use that as a way of keeping the momentum on what they themselves want to achieve. That's one condition that works. Second type of conditionality that works is if there is an immediate change, one-off change you need to make. Let's say you say, okay, exchange rate has to be changed. You're in a near crisis situation, if the IMF comes along and says part of the condition on which we give you the money is that we think you have to free up the exchange rate. You may feel you like it or you don't like it, but it's very clear you have to do it if you want the money, short term. Where it doesn't work, and I've seen this in many, many countries, is conditionality which tries to get governments to do things that they don't believe in over any length of time. And if you look at the history of IMF programs, whether you call it conditionality or you call it something else, where they have not been so successful is in the latter part of each program, which was about the changes in the structural side of the economy, public enterprise reform, etc., where there was really not a buy-in from the countryside. So I think conditionality doesn't work except in very limited circumstances.
Okay, I think it's time to go to the floor and get some questions. Let people talk to you directly. Konji, anybody who wants to speak, raise your hand. There are mics floating around.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम सर पंजाब यूनिवर्सिटी से मैं आऊँ और मेरा आपसे ये सवाल था, आप डेवलपमेंट की बात कर रहे थे। हम अगर बीएस करते हैं, पाकिस्तानी एजुकेशन सिस्टम है, उसमें जो इकोनॉमिक्स है हम वेस्टर्न इकोनॉमिक्स पढ़ते हैं, तो उसमें उसकी प्रॉब्लम्स भी होती हैं, सॉल्यूशंस भी होते हैं कि वो किस तरह डेवलप्ड हो रही हैं और वो किस तरह मूव कर रही हैं अगर वो डेवलपिंग थी और डेवलप हुई वो इकोनॉमीज़। जब हम पाकिस्तानी सिस्टम्स की प्रॉब्लम्स को भी नहीं पढ़ेंगे, उसकी स्टडीज़ को भी नहीं पढ़ेंगे, तो हमारी जो यूथ है उसकी डेवलपमेंट में किस तरह कंट्रीब्यूशन होगी? थैंक यू।
So thank you very much. As always, pleasure to listen to you. Two very quick points. एक तो डेट पे है जो आपने बात की रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग की, लेकिन अगर आप देखें जो ग्लोबल थिंकिंग इस वक्त जो मैं यहाँ देख रहा हूँ, तो वो पेरिस क्लब वगैरह तो ख़त्म होते जा रहे हैं। Now you actually borrow because of your strategic or political leverage through neighbors with China, Saudi Arabia and others. उस डेट के डायनामिक्स फ़र्क है क्योंकि वो इकोनॉमिक वैल्यू प्रोपोजिशन से लिंक नहीं है. So that debt is now 4 times more than traditional bilateral debt through Paris Club, right? So usko settle karne ke liye you don't really actually follow the path which you mentioned. There would be other things to, you know, work on that. ये सवाल किया, what's his thinking on that? यहाँ पर बहुत सारे young लोग हैं जो बैठे हुए हैं. What is the discussion about future of jobs and opportunities at that level?
हाँ जी, anybody else quickly?
अस्सलाम वालेकुम।
बोलिए।
मैं पंजाब यूनिवर्सिटी से सर, मेरा क्वेश्चन ये है कि जब आप इंटरनेशनल डेवलपमेंट की बात कर रहे थे तो उसमें जो लास्ट हमारे पास यूएनडीपी की रिपोर्ट आई 2021 की,
माइक पास रखें यार, तो
उसमें सबसे जो बड़ा हम देखने को ट्रेंड नज़र आया है कि हमें मोर देन 50% एचडीआई जो है वो हमें रिवर्सल ट्रेंड नज़र आया है। तो उसमें एक जो हमें वजह नज़र आती है वो हाई पोलराइजेशन है, जिसमें आप भी पॉइंट कर रहे थे कि यूक्रेन वार होगी, अब इसराइल फ़लस्तीन ये इशू है, तो उसमें जिससे आप डेवलप और डेवलपिंग कंट्री दोनों इम्पैक्ट हो रहे हैं। तो उसमें हमारे पास नजिंग का क्या रोल हो सकता है इन टर्म ऑफ पोलराइजेशन, और जैसे हमारे पास आप बता रहे थे कि लो इन्वेस्टमेंट हम जानते हैं, तो उसमें नजिंग का क्या रोल हो सकता है?
I think, look, the first point, if I understood it correctly, and I may not have got the point correctly, but the first one, I think, is a more general problem in economics today, which is that in a lot of universities, the teaching of economics is quite removed from the problems of economics that people face when they leave universities. And in the US, for example, in the UK, there's a whole movement of how can we make the teaching of economics, the learning of economics in universities more aligned with the problems. I mean, you can go through a 4-year course in economics and have no idea of what the world is actually doing right now in some universities. And I hope that's, I'm not sure how you're resolving that issue here, but I want to say that I think it's a real issue that needs to be addressed. Now, I think Harun raised a point about debt and China and politics. I want to use that to make 2 points. पहली बात तो ये कि you're absolutely right कि one of the reasons why we're having difficulty in dealing with the debt issues where China is a big creditor, and in many countries China is a big creditor, is not only because the Chinese themselves have no experience of dealing with debt defaults. Baki log to they've had their fingers burned over the years, so they know that this is part of life, they deal with it. But the Chinese, it's relatively recent experience. BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, they scaled up financing around the world, and some of those projects went wrong. Some of those countries ran into problems. Not everybody, but some of them did, and now they're having to figure out how to deal with this phenomenon that the money we have lent, we can't get back on the terms and times that we had discussed. So they have to figure it out. But there's a second dimension, which is that the rest of the world, I'm thinking more of the US, Europe, they don't want to sort out the debt problem for any country if they think the Chinese are getting a better deal. So वो कहते हैं जी इससे पहले कि we have any agreement, we want to have the same terms for everyone. And the Chinese are not just trying to sort it out for themselves, but they also don't have the experience of working in a multilateral framework to deal with debt. So I think this is a learning process. That's one of the reasons why it's a problem. But I want to say one thing which is related to that. Look, I think, I didn't mention it earlier, but sort of economics, sort of politics. The days when we could do development and we could do economics purely as economists and as development experts are over. अब वो ज़माना गुजर गया. पिछले 25 साल जो थे, they were developments के लिए, they were like a golden period. क्योंकि after the fall of the Cold War, you remember when the Berlin Wall fell, 1990s में, the world was feeling generous, and there was a peace dividend, and there was a sense that we need a global project. And everybody, the global project became, let's deal with promoting, alleviating poverty, promoting development. And जो development के technicians थे, हम जैसे लोग, we said कि we have the technology, we know how to do it. आप हमें पैसे दें और हमें autonomy दें, we'll do it. Now I think the world has changed. A problem ये है कि there are a lot of other people who are focused on security. We haven't mentioned once the word de-risking. But you go to an international conference today, you can't sit through 1 hour without people talking about de-risking. De-risking, how are we going to deal with global challenges like climate? So the global discussion is moving in ways where development has to fight for its space. And we have to be relevant in that discussion. And I see, I mean, maybe we'll end on this, but I do see that one of the challenges for us in the development world is that we are quite comfortable having our own conversation. We agree on the basic parameters. So हम आपस में बात करने में, we can have a very nice, interesting, rich discussion. But the decisions are not being made now only on our terms. They're political. They're worrying about climate change. They're worrying about China de-risking. And if we don't get into those debates, also if we don't get into a discussion about how artificial intelligence and technology is going to shape the future, and those are areas where we are not so comfortable. हमारी comfort zone से बाहर हैं ये सारे conversations. But unless we get into those and we bring our perspective to bear, those decisions will be made in ways that will impact on our world. So that's my my final thought in a way is that we have to step out from our comfort zone and we have to engage in the debates that are happening today rather than trying to retreat into the space where we feel we are protecting our own expertise.
Anybody else? Go ahead. किसने माइक उठाया था? बोले बोले जी, बोले.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Kamila Kasi from International Islamic University. So today we talk about investment and we discuss that growth is not possible without investment. That is the core incentive. But अगर हम investor की end से देखें, sales low है, production low है. What are the incentives for an investor to invest in a country?
Assalamu alaikum sir, I am Muhammad Ahmed from Foundation University. सर मेरा एक सवाल है कि हम लोग नेशनल और इंटरनेशनल लेवल पे काफ़ी कुछ बात कर रहे हैं लेकिन मेजॉरिटी हम में से स्टूडेंट्स है तो हाउ अ स्टूडेंट कैन ब्रिंग चेंज इन दिस इकोनॉमिक सिस्टम
My question pertains to your perception of the demographic advancement of our society and the rate at which our population is growing and what it means for development and growth overall. Thank you.
सर स्पेशल इन्वेस्टमेंट फैसिलिटेशन काउंसिल कायम हुई है सर उसमें ये कहा गया है कि जो मिनरल्स और एग्रीकल्चर सेक्टर है उसका जो तखमीना लगाया गया कि उसमें पोटेंशियल है 6 ट्रिलियन डॉलर्स का सर उसके बावजूद भी हमें कोई भी उधार देने को तैयार नहीं है और कोई भी यहाँ इन्वेस्टमेंट करने को तैयार नहीं इस पे आपकी क्या राय है थैंक यू सो मच सर
अस्सलाम वालेकुम आई एम फ्रॉम यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ चकवाल तो हम यहाँ पे सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट और डेट रिफॉर्म्स पे बात कर रहे हैं तो इसमें जो सबसे मेजर हमारे पास सेक्टर है वो हमारे पास आईपीपीज़ और एनर्जी सेक्टर्स है और जिस तरह डॉक्टर तैमूर रहमान जो है फेमस असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर है नासिर यूनिवर्सिटी में तो वो कह रहे हैं कि जो कैपेसिटी पेमेंट्स की मद में हमने आईपीपीज़ को पेमेंट करनी है तो अगले साल तक हम उसी में ही दिवालिया मुल्क निकल जाएगा तो क्या वो शॉर्ट टर्म और लॉन्ग टर्म हमारे पास फ्रेम ऑफ वर्क होना चाहिए कि हम उनको रीनेगोशिएट कर सके आईपीपीज़ के साथ थैंक यू
अस्सलाम वालेकुम सर मैं कायद आज़म यूनिवर्सिटी से हूँ सर मेरा क्वेश्चन रिगार्डिंग दी डेप्ट है तो हमने बात की है डेप्ट स्ट्रक्चरिंग के बारे में तो डेप्ट स्ट्रक्चरिंग के साथ साथ क्या हमारे पास गवर्नमेंट के पास इस तरह की कोई और भी अल्टरनेटिव्स है कि जिसको यूज़ करके गवर्नमेंट जो है अपने डेप्ट को कम कर सकती है जैसे प्रीवियस गवर्नमेंट ने एक टर्म यूज़ की थी इकोनॉमिक ऑस्टेरिटी की और उसी के साथ रेलेवेंट पाइड की एक रिसर्च भी है जिसमें उन्होंने बताया कि मिलियंस ऑफ रुपीज़ जो है वो एक फेडरल गवर्नमेंट के एम्प्लॉय पे ओवर द ईयर वो एक्सपेंस हो रहे होते हैं तो क्या इस तरह इकोनॉमिक ऑस्टेरिटी के साथ साथ कोई और अल्टरनेटिव्स है जिसको यूज़ करके जो गवर्नमेंट है वो अपने डेप्ट को जो है ना वो कम कर सके अलॉन्ग विद दी डेप्ट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग थैंक यू
I think it really is a two-level question. पहली बात तो ये कि a lot of the difficulties that we have in dealing with IPPs during the implementation phase or after come from the initial design flaws that were done. And what that tells me is that the process we have in many countries, by the way, other countries have same problems with IPPs, that the process we have for making decisions, actually Shahid Kardar is sitting in the front row and we were discussing last night, that the way decisions are made in government does not take into account the relevant technical expertise all the time, and then you only discover the cost of that much later. तो ये एक जनरल प्रॉब्लम है बहुत सारे मुल्कों में हमारे भी ये प्रॉब्लम है कि अगर आप डिसीजन मेकिंग टाइम पे सही तरीके से पूरे फैक्टर्स नहीं देखेंगे तो इट कम्स बैक एंड हॉन्ट्स यू लेटर एंड द सेकंड लेसन इज इट्स मच मोर एक्सपेंसिव टू फिक्स अ मिस्टेक than it is to spend the extra time and money to get it right. And this is also a problem that we see. Look, every time, it's not just IPPs. You can look at other contracts where, I mean, think about the Recordic, where we've had to pay much more later on to fix the problem. So I think that's a genuine design issue. Another thing I would say on IPPs, in defense of the government, that the global thinking on how to structure IPPs has improved a lot and changed a lot. Because it's not just here that people are discovering that shuru mein jab IPPs came up as a concept, everybody was very gung-ho, this is the solution. If you look at the UK, let's look at another country. UK mein, they did a lot of privatization of railroads, water company. A lot of the utilities were privatized 20 years ago. And then they discovered that the contracts they had set up, the structure they had set up, where the rail track is run by one company, the railroad is run by another company. And they thought this was very clever at the time. हम market create कर रहे हैं, एक आदमी rail track चलाएगा, railroad operators compete करेंगे. Net result क्या हुआ? आज UK में trains are more expensive than anywhere in Europe. Everybody complains about the service, and every few years they show up to ask for some money from the government. क्योंकि वो design problems जो थे, they are now coming back to haunt us. So I think people are realizing that a lot of the initial burst of thinking, okay, we can get other people to do these things, is turning out to be false. A final thing about this, I would say, is that I'm a little skeptical in life about a lot of these programs. Because the real question is not whether the public sector is taking a risk, taking the risk on itself, on its books. The question is how far you have to dig in the contract before you discover the page where ultimately the risk comes back to the public sector. But the return we often give to the private sector is based on the assumption that they are carrying the risk. But in reality, when you look around the world, I'm not talking about any particular contract, I'm not talking about any particular country, I'm making a general point that what you often find is that it's the public sector that still carries a lot of the risk in one form or the other. So I think it's just important to bear that in mind. Now, on taxes, I'm not sure exactly what the point was, but look, I think the basic point on taxes is twofold. Ek to ye ke, at the end of the day, you have to have the resources to pay for your expenditures. If you're the public sector, you spend 20-25% of your income, national income in expenditures. You have to be able to finance this, pehli baat. Dusri baat ye कि the fact that you have to be able to finance this doesn't mean that you can raise the money any which way. You have to spread it in a way that there is legitimacy and that some people don't feel that they are unfairly paying a very large share of their income in taxes and others are getting away with nothing. And the second thing is that at the end of the day, it's about social contract. Agar people don't believe that they're getting value for money on the expenditure side, then it's going to be very hard to build public consensus to raise more money. So I think we had a conversation last week in Oslo, and there was a person there from Finland, and the Finns have 50% of their income goes in taxes. And this lady said, we are very happy to pay our taxes. Finns like to pay 50% in taxes. And everybody in the room was looking at her and saying, you must be smoking something. But her point was that we are happy to pay 50%, not because we like paying money, because we like what we get in return for the 50%. So I think Nadeem, for example, has made this point over a long period, that bhai, until you sort out how the money is being spent, and if the whole conversation is about raising more money without focusing on the value for money of the expenditure side, then you're never going to build public support for broad-based increase in taxes. And I think that's a fundamental issue which sometimes in our taxation debate, the revenue people are only focused on revenue, or the expenditure side is left out of the conversation.
Before we
close, and we have to close very soon, Masood, I'd like a very quick comment on you about the tension between local and international research. Many people in Pakistan now believe, especially the government, that there's no need for local research when we got so much technical assistance available. How would you react to that?
Look, I think that I'll make 2 points about it. One is that while a lot of international agencies are increasingly providing funding for local think tanks, researchers, the relationship, how should I put it? The relationship is not one of co-creating a research agenda, but it's almost a contractual relationship in many cases, where the idea is, can you get a local partner to do some things that you would like to get done? Because you think these are important issues. And it's a little bit of a mindset change that we have to get to, where, in fact, you're supporting local researchers to work on the issues that matter to them, not on the issues that matter to you. Because, the problem is that if you fund it, it gets in the middle of the relationship of co-creation. And if you look at the research being done in countries where there is very little donor funding, it's very interesting to see that those researchers work on very different sets of issues. So I think there's a question there we should explore. And the other point I want to make is that, look, there's no alternative, because increasingly, I run a think tank in Washington. I keep telling my colleagues, you know, policymakers in developing countries have no interest anymore in having somebody sitting in Washington and telling them how they should be organizing their education sector or their health financing. The people they will listen to are the people who are working on these issues within the country. Sometimes they'll do good work, sometimes they'll do bad work. I'm not making it's not a normative statement that is better or worse. It's just a description of reality, that the people who have influence on policy are the people who are close and who are part of the context within which policy is made. And so the reality is that that is where the agenda is moving. And I think the question is, how can we support the creation of that? And by the way, I don't think it's just a responsibility of the international agencies. I think governments have to take more responsibility for creating that environment in which research is funded, but also researchers are respected and their views are heard. Because it's very frustrating for people to do research if nobody is going to listen to their point of view.
Thank you very much, Masood. Thank you. I'm sorry we have little time left. We have to move on to the next session. But thank you very much for taking time out and coming to Pakistan.